A World Bank study has revealed that climate change could displace nearly 216 million people within the next 30 years. According to the Institute for Security Studies, urgent action is needed to limit this forced migration. I'm joined now by Dhesigen Naidoo, who is the Climate Adaptation Lead at the Institute for Security Studies, to discuss this further. Dhesigen, good afternoon, sir. Welcome to today. Thank you very much for your time here on ENCA. I mean, 30 years might sound like a long time, but it is not. And if so many people could be dispersed or displaced because of climate change, what kind of things are you seeing? I mean, whereabouts and how will they be forced by weather patterns or seeking greener pastures, literally?
Hello, Dan, and hello to your viewers. Yes, as it happens, that number from the World Bank is the lower end number. The United Nations IOM, the International Organization for Migration, says that if you expand that base beyond climate change to other environmental degradation, in those 30 years, they're looking at possibly 1 billion people being migrants, either temporary migrants or sometimes permanent migrants. The grim reality is that climate change is already with us. We're at 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. It's very hot in the atmosphere. And this means high energy storms, floods, droughts, making it impossible for people to continue their livelihoods in many places around the world. And Africa is a particular hotspot. Out of the 216 million that the World Bank is talking about, almost 90 million of that is going to be inside the African continent. So people eking out a livelihood and better intergenerational opportunities for their families.
So the migrations, I mean, let's look at South Africa. We know we've had migrant labor, for example, for decades, I mean, predating colonial days, and also people looking for better opportunities and looking for food security. What patterns, what trends could we see? Would people be moving anywhere and everywhere, or there'll be certain chosen or selected preferred destinations?
Well, there are majority routes, and those majority routes generally are from rural areas into urban areas. And this is about seeing the possibility, the opportunity for some measure of livelihood that is there. And in general, at a macro regional level, it's about going from much drier places to places that are a lot less dry. So just north of us are drought conditions that are absolutely extreme, absolutely extreme. And we're talking about in SADC and then beyond SADC into the Horn of Africa. So those folk are needing to move to places where there's some measure of rainfall if they want to continue their agriculture activity, or switch completely to living in an urban environment. And so what we have to do is to deal with this at a micro level, because you're going to have that in the smallest vicinities, in the smallest districts and towns, to the macro level of seeing how we engage this issue on the continent as a whole. And there are some interesting governance innovations already at foot in Africa, not here, but between Central Africa and East Africa, that I think we should be learning from.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about, it's like climate change. Just a few years ago, we thought it's going to be happening many years from now. This is far away. But 30 years is not such a long time in the life of the planet and the human race. So what kind of measures do you think governments should begin to adopt today in anticipating these new migration trends that this new migration picture you're painting?
Well, then, you know, there are short-term things and there are long-term things. In the short term, and the short term is already here because we already have a climate refugee crisis in the world as we speak. And we know that this higher temperature phenomenon is going to go way beyond 2100. So we're in this for the long haul. So in the short term, we need to have the right kind of protocols to be able to organize, to accept and nurture these migrants. And there's a lot of hostility around migration all over the world. In fact, the elections in Europe, the elections in the United States have been dictated by an anti-immigration phenomenon that we actually have to deal with because we don't want to replicate that on this continent. In the longer term, it is about adaptation. It is about adapting to this new environment that we are in, these new weather patterns, and having better infrastructure to deal with it, better agriculture, value chains, and models. Or else we're going to be looking at this phenomenon continuing for the next century.
Yeah, and sometimes we're talking here, they're meeting in Egypt with COP27. I mean, last year they were meeting COP26 in Glasgow in Scotland. Of course, top of mind is around the issue of funding the just transition, you know, with low and middle income countries like South Africa who have contributed very little to the global carbon emissions picture, but now they have to dig deep to find the money. That's a top of thing. Should this be factored? I mean, if you were at COP27, would you be raising these issues you're raising now to say they need to be making sure that the necessary resources will also be put towards managing this upcoming migration?
Well, then, you know, the South African delegation, which is in sync with the African delegation and the developing world delegation, led by President Ramaphosa, is making this point very graphically in the COP, that one, the North has to come to the party around dealing with the issue that it, in fact, generated. We are living on the back of carbon emissions that has accumulated in the atmosphere by developed countries, primarily. If you don't want developing countries to add to that, you have to aid how their energy transition can work so that they don't have to go on this high carbon pathway. And this is something that I think is being accepted more and more and more. The numbers, of course, need to be negotiated. One of the things that is on the table is South Africa's own just energy transition deal that it has with 5 northern partners that could become a model that the other parts of the world could use. And it is about moving beyond the ODA into now other funding, innovative funding mechanisms to make this happen. But the other big issue around this that we have to deal with is that we have to pay for the adaptation that has to happen right now. We have to pay for better infrastructure that's climate resilient. We have to pay for developing seawalls and other things that protect our coastal cities. And here again, we're looking at this solidarity pact that the UN Secretary General spoke about very graphically, the Climate Solidarity Pact. And then we have to see about how we can reskill people who have been oriented to a different way of doing things to now working in a low carbon economy successfully towards prosperity. Because the alternative is too grim. And the UN Secretary General pointed it out. He said you either have the Solidarity Pact, which means also putting the money up, or we're all in a collective suicide pact, is the way that he put it.
Wow, what a picture. Thank you very much, Dhesigen Naidoo. Sobering insights there and about the future in terms of the impact of climate change and set to displace over 216 million people worldwide over the next 30 years. And over 90 million of them will be here on our continent, Africa. That was